The Kingsley Plantation is a fascinating site that portrays the history of a unique time in Florida when it was a Spanish colony and American territory. The plantation is on Fort George Island, which is one of the myriad barrier islands along the East Coast. It was established by a slave trader and planter named Zephaniah Kingsley in 1814, and he owned it until 1837. With the help of 60 to 80 slaves, Kingsley primarily grew a high-quality cotton known as Sea Island cotton, as well as crops like corn, sugarcane, and citrus. When you first approach the site, you drive down a road leading to what would be the back of the plantation. In the time when the plantation was operational, the front of the property was where the main plantation house faced the Fort George River, since the river was the primary mode of transport. Entering from the rear, you first drive past the old plantation fields, which are now overgrown, until you arrive at the slave quarters. The slave quarters are situated a good distance behind the plantation house and a barn close to the house. One of the unique things about the Kingsley Plantation is that the slave quarters are built in an unusual semicircle pattern reminiscent of African villages. There were 32 slave houses originally on the plantation, 25 of which are still standing today. They are constructed of tabby and show evidence of the fact that many of the slaves on the plantation were able to retain their African heritage to some extent. Further evidence of this is the archaeological discovery of chickens and deer parts buried at the doorstep of the houses. Chicken sacrifice and burial was a common African religious practice used to bless a house or celebrate a life event like birth or death and protect from evil. Other evidence of the slaves practicing their African culture is the way that they buried other slaves in a semicircle around one of the large trees on the plantation, pictured in the middle. This is similar to burial practices used in Africa. The slaves on the Kingsley Plantation seem to have a relative amount of agency compared to other plantations. This may have been because Zephaniah Kingsley adhered to the Spanish tax system instead of the gang system of slave labor, and he owned the plantation under the Spanish government. In the tax system, once slaves completed an assigned duty, they could be free to pursue their own social and economic activities, like socializing in their yards and houses or growing gardens. The Spanish form of slavery was less brutal than the form of slavery in the American South. Because Zephaniah Kingsley's plantation was in the Spanish colony of Florida, slaves had more rights. They could buy themselves and their families out of slavery. They could own property, and they could sue their owners. The Spanish colonial government was more humane towards slaves, seeing them as humans in a condition of slavery and not as inhuman property. Kingsley also married one of his slaves, Anna Kingsley, and let her manage parts of the plantation. This may have been why there are unusual aspects of the plantation, like the slave houses arranged in an African fashion, and Anna's kitchen and parlor built apart from the main house, so that she had her own space, pictured on the right. Despite the fact that the slaves were allowed to keep some of their cultural identity, there are clear differences between them and their owners. There are still 2 pillars of a gate leading to the plantation house that clearly separates the white and black space on the plantation. The slave houses are set far back, out of sight, and given much less attention than the main house. Even among the slave cabins, the slave drivers lived in the larger cabins in the middle and ends of the semicircle. While the slaves might have had some agency, they were slaves and their freedoms were very restricted. The Kingsley Plantation is important to Florida history because it is one of the oldest living examples in Florida of a significant historical period. The plantation house is the oldest one still standing in Florida. It, along with the slave houses and property, represent a unique time in Florida history, a time when Florida was a foreign country. Spain had a major influence on Florida, such as creating a more fluid form of slavery and race relations. Plantations became an important economic unit under Spanish rule. Florida also became a U.S. territory in 1821, while Zephaniah still owned the plantation. Florida changed significantly when it transitioned from a Spanish colony to an American territory. Slavery became more brutal, and the Southern-style plantation model was introduced in much of the state. The politics, society, and economy of Florida changed in important ways, and the Kingsley plantation was a witness and symbol of those changes. The plantation and the accounts of the people who lived there provide an informative and nuanced portrayal of life under the Spanish colonial rule and American territorial conquest. The site shows how people responded and adjusted to slavery. Slaves, slave owners, blacks, whites, and family within Spanish and American contexts. The Kingsley Plantation is important to Florida history because it provides a physical connection to the past and a key understanding of a past that was vital in shaping the state's future.